Welcome back to another episode of the podcast. We have on Merle Singer to the show today, and today in this conversation we really talk about how we can use archetypes in the use of leadership and leadership theory, which is awesome. And if you haven't listened, so Merle was recommended to me through Carl Pearson. If you haven't listened to her podcast, it's listen below. And we talked about what archetypes are and how you can apply them to your life. In this conversation, we really talk about how leadership theory and archetypes work together. And if you guys don't know what an archetype is, essentially they're like old school patterns within ourselves and consciousness that humans have had and have evolved with throughout history, religion, and teachings. And essentially, Paul Chek put it in a really good way, is that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and an archetype is worth 1,000,000 pictures. So that's just to put it into perspective and how you can actually use those to transcend your life and make it better, especially if you want to be a better version of yourself, especially if you want to be a leader. So this podcast will really get into it, and it was just a really awesome conversation that we had. So if you liked it and if you got any value out of it, please give it a like, share, and subscribe. That really helps with the YouTube algorithm, the podcast algorithm, and that helps bring out the podcast grower and gets us really good information out there. So thank you so much if you do that. Also, I have some coaching available, and if you are interested in coaching, you want to be your best version of yourself, you want to overcome imposter syndrome, you want to understand the archetypes, the hero's journey, all of those different things, that is available. You can just send me a message or click one of the links below and we can get started there. I have a training program available, so like literally in the gym, how to train. And essentially, if you're sick of having like cookie cutter programs and you want something that actually works and you want to learn something as you go and enjoy the experience throughout that, then click one of the links below. I've got a video explaining the whole process there, so that could be very interesting to you. I also have a recipe ebook available for stuff that I've got, and how I come up with that is I researched every single healthy ingredient possible, like ever, and put that into a whole bunch of recipes, like for meal prep, bone broths, all these really good quality recipes that are really, really healthy. So if you want to get healthy, like that recipe ebook is like number one for you. And also, speaking of bone broths, I have a bone broth discount. You can get 12% off if you click on one of the links below, which is Best of the Bones bone broth, which is the best bone broth because they're grass-fed Australian cows and they cook it over a slow process, so there's no damage to the bone broth, so it's just really high quality. So yeah, guys, and again, if you guys like this podcast, please give it a like, share, and subscribe. So I really hope you guys enjoy this podcast. I hope you listen to it and watch it the whole way through, because we get into we go over really awesome stuff in this. So without any further ado, guys, I bring to you this uninterrupted podcast, the Corey Batwell podcast with Merle Singer, and I hope you guys enjoy it. And of course, this podcast is brought to you by Eternum Labs, which is the best supplement company if you really want to perform at your peak. We just have a range of new products come in, antioxidants and sleep products like glutathione, NAC, and Apigenin, some really high quality stuff. So if you're interested in those, you can get a discount with using the code Corey, COREY, on eternumlabs.com.au. Thank you. G'day, Mel. Thank you so much for coming onto the show.
Thank you for having me, Corey. Very happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming on and having a good chat. I'd like to know, recently, what have you been doing, working on, learning?
Wow, that's a really big one.
Oh.
Well, I think you know that I've spent 3 years doing a fairly large research project through one of the universities, Deakin University's business school down in Melbourne. And it's just really beginning to birth. And that's not all I do. I work with leaders mainly in technology, but also banking and finance and various other sectors. But this is what I think is my vocational calling, and so it feels like it's birthing, and that's really exciting for me. Yeah,
and just to put it out there, for anyone who's listening, like Deakin is a very prestigious business school where a lot of people who graduate university and get jobs and have highly prestigious jobs, people send them to Deakin University to learn and get taught by people like you and understand all the stuff that's happening so that they can be better leaders. Yeah. So let me know what's been happening with some of the research. I'd love to dive into it.
So the research itself, Corey, what it looked at, and when I started it, I'd actually been living down in Melbourne. I was coming back to Sydney, and I'm kind of like an easy instant person. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to do a little piece of research when I get back to Sydney. And just before I left, I sat down with one of the senior lecturers at the business school who I know, a woman called Dr. Heather Round. And she was super quiet through our conversation. I thought, oh gosh, all right, that's obviously hasn't landed very well. And at the end of it, she said, would you be interested in working under the auspices of the university? Because we like to work with practitioners. And because I'm, again, Izzy Instant and actually think about it, I thought, brilliant, love to. And so started what was going to be a little light touch piece of research, ended up being a very lengthy 3-year, really well managed project. And I guess I should tell you what it's about, because that's
I'd love to know.
So I was really interested in what are the changing narratives related to leadership for millennials as opposed to, let's say, more of the senior executives. And I actually came to it with initially looking at women, but actually as it grew, it ended up being all millennials and then sort of senior executives. So it was a really interesting piece of work, both here in Australia and also in the US. So it's got, a number of different ways you can cut the data.
Yeah. What were some of the interesting findings? What was something that you thought was quite important to know?
I think there's a whole heap. But certainly, we just throw it out there, the big ones. I know you've had Carol Pearson on the show, and we actually used her assessment, the Pearson Ma archetype indicator. So everybody who participated in the study used that. And what was super interesting for us is that across the sample, both here and in the US, archetypally, there was a real shift, we thought, from, I guess, more that heroic leader, the idea of, flying in on a charger and leading from the front. Yes.
Yeah.
There was a real sense, I think, from both senior executives but millennials, that's still the style that gets you further in corporate life, but that nobody actually aspired to that. So people, the focus is much more on knowledge rather than the sort of the system. So people kind of showed up a lot more on the sage. So think the cool, analytic, left brain thinker, the magician. I always think of the magician as being able to see round corners, and much more around figuring out information in terms of your gut. So it's a kind of gut response, which the magician has, and paired with the sage, which is really about, analysis. It's such a powerful combination. And then the third one, which was also interesting, was that people showed up with a very high realist, which is really a practical thinker. Like, what do I do with all of this information, and how do I actually lead, I guess, in a practical way. So there's some quite interesting things archetypally that showed up. And then some of the themes, which I don't think will be a huge shock, was the level of anxiety, which was extremely high, particularly, but not exclusively, to millennials, and then even more to millennial women. And what's interesting, it's just something for me when I look at what the pandemic has done, is I think it's been a great leveler for people around anxiety, and people really experiencing anxiety at all levels, intergenerational levels, genders. It's interesting.
So what does that mean for people who are, aspiring to be leaders?
So I always say, part of it, and I think why there's been such a big focus on showing up, authentic leadership, why there's a whole focus on what it means to really be vulnerable as a leader. I think people are expecting leaders to show up, and I like the word genuine, because it feels
Feels genuine.
It feels genuine, but it's true. I think people want you to show up warts and all. And there's something there about being boundaried in the way you reflect your warts and all. But I think I think you don't have to be perfect. And, really what we saw in the research was people saying, we want you to show up. So we want to be able to show up fully, and we expect you to do it as a leader as well.
Have you got any sort of practical tools? If people, I know there's a whole lot of research, you can use one or two examples. I'm sure you have a million to choose from. But let's say if someone was like, cool, all right, I get that, and I want to start being a better leader. What are some of the things that I could actually start to do in terms of moving that forward?
Yeah, I think there's a few things, Corey, and, spoken with a realistic thinking process. What are the practical applications here? Mm-hmm. I say to anybody that I coach or anybody that I work with, I obviously work with a lot of leaders, you've got to know yourself. You've got to actually come to know yourself. And oftentimes we may run away from ourselves or ignore what we know is, kind of happening there. But find a tool or an assessment or something that gives you some of the language that makes sense to you. That's the first thing. I think the second one that I think for me is really important. I am less interested in all your strengths and how fabulous you are. I'm really interested in what lies in shadow. So what is not seen? What are the things that kind of trip you up that you may be unaware of? Other people may be aware of it. So there's something there about inner safe space, really exploring that. So I think that's a second piece. And then the third one, which I'll show you over here, get yourself a journal. And, this is the kind of work that we will do pretty much in any ongoing team engagement. We'll start off and introduce the idea of using journals. And lots of people will be, I don't have words, I can't write, I can't spell. I've tried it before, it doesn't work. Just try. Even if it is 2 minutes on waking, just to get some of the dross out of your head. And eventually you'll see thematics coming up, things that keep repeating. You go, gosh, I keep writing about that, or I keep thinking about that. What does that mean in relation to me? What does that mean in relation to me being a leader? And then the fourth thing that I would suggest for people who are looking at, how do I expand my repertoire as, just leading people, is figure out somebody, or maybe even think of it if you've got a board of directors, and certainly I know you work with a lot of entrepreneurs, you'd have a board of directors. So in a way, that same board of directors, except for people to give you some input in a safe way. What's working? When I'm at my best, what does it look like? When I'm off kilter, what happens? And what are the signs that you see in me? These are some of the things that I think are quite practical ways to explore that.
And confronting too, especially for someone who's a leader, if you're going to ask for some feedback, but I guess it depends, how much you strive to be a leader or find yourself in positions, like being someone who actually asks proactively for feedback can be so critically important.
And I know you work on in the health and wellness space, and any change is not easy. When they might look at you having, and I'm sure you have an 8-pack, they might look and go, I want that as well. I'm sure there's an enormous amount of work, and at times would have been, I don't want to do this anymore. It's exhausting. I'm not getting anywhere. Doesn't make sense. I should just be able to do it immediately. And that's another thing. I think we are all so immediate in everything that we do. The internet has social media. Everything is instant. I always say to people, this just shows how ancient I am. I grew up we didn't even have an answer phone. You know, people go, I don't even know what you're talking about, an answer phone at home. Well, we had answer phones. So if you weren't at home when somebody rang, you didn't know when they'd ever rung. So there's something about allowing things time to get there.
Yeah.
You can't do it immediately.
Yeah. And I think
It's
that's
time.
like hard to actually catch up on yourself on that. I think that's really difficult. Where I guess the power of journaling would really come in handy.
Yeah.
Yeah,
100%.
for sure. I'd love to dive a little bit deeper into the actual archetypes, if you wouldn't mind going into that, and
sure.
and your experience and your relation with the archetypes and how they've helped you and how you've helped other people. I'd love to talk about like the archetypes and your experience with them. And then I'd love to talk about like a success story or something that you've had using the archetypes with someone.
Oh, wow. Okay. So there's so much to speak about with the archetypes. I guess how I came to them and why I've loved them.
Yep.
I think that a lot of, and I work with a number of assessments. So this is not saying, there's always place for multiple different types of psychological assessments and personality tests and Strengthsfinders. They all have a place. But what I really loved about archetype is they felt possible. So there was a possibility about them, and there was a malleability, there was a flexibility in it. So there's a great deal of context to how you show up in terms of archetype. And I loved that because it gave me, in the way that I could view things, it gave me a way to look at archetype as a sort of a kit bag. I always think of this, if you're going on, a date, you might not want to go with the warrior, you might not want to go in for a fight to win. Maybe you do, but I'd say you could call on something that's maybe a little bit more, maybe more of the lover. You might be calling on that, so that might be there. And so I think there's something about being in conversation, that you're not just at, whichever way the wind blows. You're much more about, how am I showing up? What am I doing? How am I presenting? Again, in a genuine way. This isn't just like I'm putting a mask on, but really thinking about the ways that activate that. And oh God, I don't know, about 10 years ago, just after I left my corporate life, we set up something called Boot and Soul Camp, which was with a yoga friend of mine. And we kind of incorporated it with archetype and a journey of that, and yin yoga. And we all, then drank red wine on the Saturday night. It was aimed, really, it was a women's group, to be honest. But what I loved about it was to see how people opened up in that way, that there was this beautiful common language that people were able to share and really get to kind of the nub of things. So if that gives you a little flavor as to why I've really loved, I guess, the depth and breadth of it. Yeah. It's interesting when I think of, success stories.
Because there won't be so much success, right? Because you'd have to like break a lot of time if you're doing the shadow stuff, as you mentioned. It'd be like, someone got completely broken down, and now we build them back up.
I think that, for me, the success, and I just look at it in terms of the research, pretty much for everybody involved in that research. So they do the assessment, and then we'd spend between an hour and an hour and a half in quite in-depth conversation. And what struck me pretty much across the board, even though I said to them, you do not have to use the language of archetype. We've been through that. Now we can, we're just going to have a conversation. Pretty much to a person, the archetypes were referred to. So they would either say, that's my warrior coming out, or, I'm so tired of being a caregiver. I'm a caregiver to the kids. I'm a caregiver at work. So I look at that and I go, it's not just, it's pretty much everyone that I've worked with who works with archetype is fascinated by two things. It's simplicity and its complexity. And that's the paradox of it, that it's super easy to get a feeling on it because we've all have a movie we love, there's certain music we listen to, there's poetry we might read, that all of these things are so interrelated with the concept of archetype. Even how we are marketed to, all the brands that we love have very deep archetypes. So these things are just, I think, an intrinsic part of the human condition. And so I don't know about a success story, but more about the beauty and the success that just having a look into archetype might reveal for you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree anymore. I think it's one of those. I love that it's so simple and complex at the same time.
Yes, it is.
And I think that is. I think you explained it beautifully. I'm just trying to explain it in my own words so that I understand. And that is like the whole feeling side of it. I get, because I work with like the people that I coach, because I coach a lot of men. So we just keep it real simple and just do the king, warrior, magician, lover, and just go a bunch of different things around those. And it's very easy to get the feeling of it. Like you're like, oh, that's what that feels like. You close your eyes, you do a visualization, you're like, oh, that's what that feels like. But then when we dive deep into actually where it come from and what happened, and like I remember reading on some of the research, I don't know if it's outdated or not, but it was just like even looking at Carl Jung's personality types, and then they were matching up the personality types to the different archetypes and how that was working. And then the brain science between which parts of people's brains are working at the same time that they're embodying a certain archetype, or they're being like a part of that. It just blew my brain. I was like, literally. So it's like, it's got the spiritual element, it's got the psychological element, and it has the biological element as well, with all this brain science stuff to show that it exists. It just fascinated me.
And it's true. That's the reason that I think a lot of people are taken with it. It is about embodying it. And so when people talk about authentic leadership, often we've come at it in a more brain part, the sage. I am now authentic, right? I think where we talk about embodying authenticity is really what you're talking about, that the easiest one to think about is the warrior, and there might be a few warriors that
there's a couple listening.
There's a couple listening. There's a couple listening.
Yeah.
Their amygdala, which is the sort of the fight and flight part of our brain. When we are in that, and we in that warrior moment, that can light up. That can light up quite brightly, and it's to know when to call on it. You don't have to be the warrior all the time. Yeah. But good to have when it's the right place to have it and embody it. And I love that. Yes, spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical.
Yeah. It's quite beautiful. And it's important to know when to be aware to get out of them. I've been stuck in this one for too damn long. Do you have any examples of certain situations that when you talk to leaders and sort of like educate them on these things and how they want to use these different archetypes? Do you have any like situations or examples that you're aware of?
You mean where people want to maybe shift or bring up perhaps ones that aren't the usual way of operating? Like
sort of like a scenario that comes along often, or an example that you would use if you were coaching a leader, obviously, because they're going to be in parts because they're inspiring people, they're going to be motivating people, they're going to be dealing with a lot of stress, and they probably have some common archetypes, and they probably have some archetypes that they need to try and embody and stuff. So I'd love to hear some scenarios if you have any.
So, I mean, again, we asked for some of the practical things. I would say if people were interested in doing the archetype stuff, not just because I've worked on it and actually use it all the time, but the Pearson archetype indicator is really great, and it's it's not too pricey, and it gives you a really clear your top three. And that usually are things that people go, oh, yeah, that's me. Oh, yeah, that's totally me. Yep, totally me. And then it'll also give you your kind of bottom one or two. And often people go, oh, I think I'm not so low on that. And then you can have a conversation about that and what that means. But I'd go, it gives you your 12 in order of how they show up. So if we usually, and all of us do, we tend to, I guess, operate in those top 3 or 4. But if you're wanting to, and particularly as a leader, you work with different people and you've got to inspire them and bring them along, or maybe have a tough conversation. And in your usual way, it might not be the best way to either inspire or have a tough conversation or redirect them, is to look at what else is in the kit bag that actually, with a little bit of tweaking, I can sort of bring into the picture. And I mean, I think lots of people listen to music. That's why if you go to a gym, it's kind of like pumping, kind of, It's lots of warrior stuff there. If you're going to have a tough conversation and you want to be empathic, pick your music. When you're driving into the office or to have a coffee or something, or you're walking and you've got it on your headphones, be careful about what you listen to. Be careful the podcasts you listen to. Making sure that you are beginning to activate using all your senses, whatever else you want to bring into the room.
Yeah, that's really powerful. I think activating all of your senses in there is really important, because that's like really hard to do. I'd love to talk more about, I'm assuming you would have some strategies in terms of actually having tough conversations, difficult conversations, or performance conversations. A lot of the people that I coach or talk to, we find ourselves at a very common thing where people have to have a performance conversation with someone at work, when they have to have a conversation with the partner, when they're living with someone and they have to have a performance conversation there, or they need to talk to their boss or something, where they actually have to come in and have a performance or a tough conversation. I'd love to hear your thoughts on those and some strategies to get good at them.
Yeah. Yes. Well, first, in the spirit of genuineness, we do actually teach around having tough conversations, but I myself am particularly bad at having tough conversations. Just put that out there. So I think that, if we come to a conversation where we open enough to actually hear what the other person has to say, we're actually listening. That's difficult, because often we've made our decision about what we want to have the conversation about, and we are there to talk to the person. Were we able to listen and respond in a mindful way, and we take out the emotional part, because what happens where the thing escalates is where there's over emotion from both sides. Yeah. So if you can kind of stick to, as much as fact is at times fiction, if you can kind of stick to, let's put this thing, and we're going to try to sort out this place, which is kind of common ground. And to start it with the fact that you might not have all the information, or you might not be you just there to deliver a message. That's a very different thing to having a difficult conversation. So difficult conversation for me means you are also there to listen and to actually hear what's being said. And that demands a really different place, where it's almost like we have to park what we're desperate to say and be able to hear what the other person is saying to us, and then respond. And also what I think that does, I mean, for all of us, tough conversations or not, when I actually feel like I've been heard, you've actually heard me. You haven't gone, yes, but. Yes, but. In fact, there is a really practical thing. If you're listening to somebody, yes, but has just said to me that everything I've said is meaningless. If I even go, yes, and what I'd like to add to that is just the word yes and yes but. It's a really interesting one. We hear how many times we can say but. Yes, but I can't do that, or yes and I can do that. So I think that coming in prepared to listen, prepared to actually explore what the data is and what the facts are, really begins to take out, I think, some of that heightened fire and steam in those conversations. Not always, but you'll find if you listen and you actually think you might learn something in that experience, it can be different.
Oh, for sure. And I think a real what as you were speaking, that one thing that clicked in my head was, if you feel that you're at the point where you have to deliver a message to someone, and then you have to have a tough conversation, and then you have to ask the questions and really listen. It's like, if you're at that point where you feel like you have to deliver a message, then you shouldn't be delivering a message at all.
or you just are there to deliver a message.
Yeah. Or sometimes,
I'm not here to listen. I'm actually not here. We're done talking.
Yeah.
That's the message. Well, you're probably going to either have, fury or tears or something.
Yeah.
But if you've come to deliver a message, it's not about that's not for me about really having a tough conversation. A tough conversation is there's at least two people in that engagement.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's extremely important for people to know, because performance conversations and tough conversations just happen all the time, and it's very underlooked.
Well, I think because I think for many, many people, it's tough. There are a handful of people that I know who are incredibly good about it. And I think there's a few things that have stood out for me. One is they are undefensive.
What do you mean by that?
They're not there to stand their position. They kind of have the conversation, but they're willing to listen to what you have to say. Might not shift their dial, but the person doesn't feel that they're going to be attacked by the person delivering that initial conversation. They also don't add too much. They just say what needs to be said. They don't then, which I think I tend to do, is just go on and add to it and add and etc., which I think lots of people do. They just say what needs to be said and no more. Without it being brutal, they just put that out there and then ask the question, how do you experience that? They instead, well, what do you feel about that? What do you think about that? Or, what are your thoughts on it? So they remove the, well, what do you feel about that? That immediately is going to say, well, I feel angry, I feel sad, or whatever. But if you're saying, what do you think about it? You're asking people to operate in a different way. But I think that the big one is they can also know the part they may be playing in what is actually taking place. So it's much easier to point your finger at somebody else. Let's just say it's just a tough conversation about something. It's their fault. They did something. You've been perfect. Is to have a look at what part, or what has my behavior been, or what have I been, how have I been behaving, what have I been speaking about, how have I been engaging with this person, what part have I played? So this is more about the shadow, what might I not know that's actually been causing this from happening? And I think that takes a really, really...
a lot of emotional control.
Well, and clarity, and the fact that actually you've got a part to play in whatever is happening. You have a part to play.
And knowing that, yeah.
And knowing that, yeah.
Yeah, which is, I think, is really important. Is actually, as you just mentioned, like it's just so funny. Sometimes, as you mentioned, the simple and complex things just come up again for me. It's just like, knowing your role is so simple, but if you truly understand and go through and you're really clear on your role, it's just makes things so much smoother. And another thing that you've mentioned as well, which I've sort of taken like a mental note on, is just how important it is to have a really good inner dialogue. And I think through the work of being a leader, through the work of archetypes, through the work of psychology, through the work of shadow work, you can really start to understand what you need to say within terms of your own mind. And when you get results, obviously they're going to stay in there. And I think, like, personally, correct me if I'm wrong, but something that could help that out would be actually doing some sort of shadow work.
Well, I mean, I love shadow work. So yes, knowing what's there. There's a really beautiful thing if people want to have a look at it. It's really simple. It's called Johari's Window. And what it is, it's sort of 4 quadrants. So yeah, 4 quadrants. And the first one is what I know about myself and what you know about me. Yeah. So it's kind of shared information. And then there's the shadow side, what you know about me, but I don't know about me.
Ooh.
Then there's the part which is what I know about me, but you don't know about me.
So they're both in the shadow. So you got the light.
Well, one is in, it's not really, it's in, I know about it. You just don't know about it, but that's really the shadow. And then there's the other, in the sort of the bottom right-hand quadrant is kind of this place that what I don't know and what you don't know, and is a kind of a discovery and the opportunity to both discover something. And the idea is in leadership is to expand that area of what we both know about me or about you, whatever it's about, about one, that area becomes a lot more conscious and a lot more visible. And then that talks to things like being genuine, that talks to awareness, that talks to not having your shadow keep tripping you up all the time. And so it's a really simple piece, but when you have a look at it as a diagram, it's a really interesting one. It's very simple to understand. And you could almost plot when you spoke to people
where they're going to be.
How much do I know about you?
Yeah.
How much do you know about me? Yeah.
Do you know any other exercises like that explore into the shadow a bit more?
Well, I think archetype enters that place. I think that's a big one. There are lots of things that people can do. They could do a Strengthsfinder. I know you can do. In fact, I think you can do it online. Also, not too expensive, and it can look at. I always think don't always overplay your strengths. It's like overplaying your archetypes. It'll really give you an idea of, wow, yeah, no, I know that's who I am. And then maybe just ask the question, do I ever overplay them? And maybe you have a resounding, I never overplay them. Then I would actually ask somebody else, do I ever overplay? Do I ever overplay these? Yes or no? Just gives you... Again, you know what, Corey, it comes back to how do you get to know yourself more? That's all. How do I get to understand myself? And, you said something about the internal voice and having this really good internal voice. I think we all have internal voices, and the internal voice, I mean, certainly I can only speak for the people that I've worked with. But I think women tend to have very loud internal voices, and not always pleasant ones, that can be quite fierce. So I always think with the internal voice, be careful what it's saying to you as well. There's like what do they say? There's like the good angel and the bad angel. Is just be really clear about what's being told to you. And, I've been told this thing of sometimes just saying, you know what, I know that's what you want to say, but I'm asking you to keep quiet. Actually, to be, not necessarily out in the supermarket, speaking out loud to a voice in your, but just enough. This is not serving me.
Yeah. I think that's really powerful. Mm-hmm. I think that's and it's really difficult just to be aware of and to understand it. Obviously, when it's coming up, to be like, shush you and feeling a little bit weird within yourself. You're like, oh, I'm talking to myself in my own head, but hey, we talk to ourselves in our own head all day, every day anyway.
Correct. They say like if you're doing meditation, there's always the thing that people say, I can't shut my mind down. Well, you can't, of course not, because you'd be dead. It's just allowing those thoughts to kind of come and go. But we are busy all the time. That our brain is working and talking and chattering constantly. That's the truth.
Yeah, it's so true. I've been reading, I'm halfway through reading James Hillman's The Soul's Code. And I also read, I can't remember who the author was, but it was in a work. And it was someone who was talking about how Carl Jung had conversations with his archetypes. And it mentioned at the start of the book, and for anyone who's listening, Carl Jung is one of the world's best psychologists. And it talks about how Carl Jung claimed it was the best thing that he'd ever figured out to do. But it wasn't until I've dove in deep into the rabbit hole of researching all of this where it actually popped out as an exercise to do. Do you know anything about that, or do you find that like beneficial in terms of?
Definitely talk to those loud and noisy ones.
Yeah.
That lead you all the time. It's that conversation, and it's not something, I think just enter this gently, because you're going to suddenly find, people just chattering to themselves. It's just being aware, there's enough going on in our lives that we don't need us to tell ourselves all manner of, terrible things. We need to shut that voice down. I actually have a friend who always says to me, don't be mean to my friend Merle. Which I think is such a beautiful, when I've got something's going on, I then think to myself, don't be mean to my friend Merle. And so there's just, take it gently. Again, you don't have to go at this bull at a gate. Just notice what comes up.
Yeah.
And kind of go, are these thoughts that I'm thinking about, particularly, let's say you presenting, or you raising capital, or you are, you're thinking of pivoting your business. Fear is a good thing. There's, what do they say fear stands for? Feeling excited and ready. It's just, you need enough fear, you need enough anxiety, you need enough of all of these things to keep going. What you don't want to do is to be overwhelmed. And there's a beautiful concept of creativity in this way. Elizabeth Gilbert wrote, Eat, Pray, Love, very famous book, but she's written, a gazillion other books, and she's such a fantastic speaker, and she's wonderful to listen to, and her books are amazing. But she talks about the creative process. So this is one thing that I think is such, and I'm paraphrasing, and I'm probably going to miss all the elements of it, but for best I can remember. She tells this fantastic story of beginning to write a book, and I think this is an ancient kind of Greek idea, that there are the creative daemons that live in the walls, right? And they are looking for their creative idea to take shape and form. They're looking for somebody to inhabit that creativity. And she gives a really interesting and almost unbelievable story of writing a book and then being taken off the path through personal circumstances. And somebody else she knew wrote that book with slightly different tales, slightly different heroes and heroines in the book. But the actual book needed a place, needed someone to write it. It wasn't her, but it was actually someone that she knew. Without them talking about it, it found this other person. So there's this really beautiful idea that creativity is also out there, not necessarily contained within.
We just channel it.
You just channel it. And the second part that she tells is when she's about to write a book, then fear takes over, and it tells her all manner of terrible things. Terrible idea, the book's never going to be a success, you're not going to write, whatever. And she says she thinks of it as almost taking a ride in the car. She invites anxiety and fear to come along, but they have to sit in the back seat of the car.
I love that.
And they can't pick the music. They can't pick the direction or which map they're going to follow to get to wherever they're going. They can just kind of come with for the ride. And she says in that way, what you do is you still still the fear and anxiety. And certainly if your entrepreneurs would have creative and all of that, those voices can get very loud, very, very loud.
Have you looked at any of Stephen Pressfield's stuff?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, because it's kind of similar to some of the stuff that he writes, but he doesn't say it in the way that she does. He just says, like, in terms, he helps people sort of, he's got some really, really awesome books, but one of them he talks about overcoming his like writer's block and doing the work. And it's basically setting up his setting and environment all the time to basically allow him to get into a creative state, which is quite fantastic. And he talks about sort of these really nice self-overcoming ideas that are very common to ones that you were saying, just sort of like a different approach into order to allow creativity to flow, which I find quite fantastic, that there's some massive correlation between those. So yeah, I think that's really cool. So in terms of actual like developing like, you know, creative stuff and being a better leader, what do you think would be sort of, you know, if someone was listening, because that's sort of a lot to take into, what do you think are some sort of strategies that people could implement in order to get better at that?
I've got to go back, Corey, to get to know yourself.
Yep, I love it.
It's
just that important. Just keep saying it. Get to know yourself.
Just get to know yourself, and the more you know, and the more you understand the impact you have, or the lack of impact you have, the more you understand how you influence or don't influence, how you bring people along or how you don't bring people along. Get to see the part that you keep playing in things. Get to see what themes keep playing out for all of us. We all have themes. You know, personally and professionally. I mean, I always think personal and professional is exactly the same thing. You know, it's just the same thing. This is your life. So look at the themes that keep showing up, and also just to know what's the part that I play. Because as a leader, you may be leading people. You also might be leading customers. You might be leading thought leadership. What are you doing to enhance that? And therefore, what part are you playing in it? So I always come back to, just got to know yourself.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And obviously that comes into shadow work and other stuff. But one common thing that keeps popping up into my mind as we're talking about this, what we've mentioned, which is sort of just kept triggering, was the word self-acceptance. Because I think it's one thing to get to know yourself, but then also to accept yourself is another one. And you've touched on that like quite a few times. Do you do anything in that sort of space?
Well, I always quote Oscar Wilde: "Be yourself, because everyone else is taken."
That's a really good quote. I like that. I'm going to steal that one. That is fantastic.
Well, it's not stolen. It's Oscar Wilde's very, very famous quote. He's certainly somebody I would like at my dinner party. But it's just the truth. You can't be somebody else. So you might as well inhabit who you are. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't have boundaries, that you shouldn't understand like things that don't serve you or things that might not serve other people. But you might as well do it your way. And, you know, I always think of one of my bosses who was my boss for many, many years. And he always felt like he inhabited his skin. So Steve felt like he inhabited his skin. He's one of life's incredibly special human beings. And he always felt truly that he inhabited himself. That is, I can't think of any other word to describe him. Yeah. He's a good man. He's a man filled with integrity, but he felt like he really was who he was.
Yeah, I wonder what kind of
great
work
role
that
model
as well. Yeah, All right, I think that's really good. I'd love to ask you the question. So just for anyone who's listening for the moment, because they've just got like headphones in their ears, and we've talked about Carol Peterson's assessment that people can go and do. Carol Pearson's assessment that we can go through and actually do in terms of to actually invest into ourselves and actually understand what the archetypes are doing and everything like that. But just from like your knowledge, I'd just love to like sort of leave people with a gift. If from what you think would be really important, if people had if you had just a couple of questions or like a little sequence of questions or something that people could they could even like pause, ask themselves, or if they had a pen and paper handy, they could like write out in terms of just to, start them on the journey to this stuff if they see that if it's good for them or it just could have some real big benefit for them. Is there anything that you could provide in terms of that out of all the research and stuff that you've done that could be really important?
Yeah, I think that maybe for people to think about or even ask themselves the question, when I'm leading, how true am I to myself? Is the way that I lead people or process or customers serving both myself and whomever else is impacted by that? Might there be a better way for me to be leading? Maybe there isn't. Maybe the answer is a firm no. I am perfect. I do not have to change a thing. But I think those questions might begin to have you think about things. And the other thing, which is it's an interesting one for people who are maybe not that interested in sort of the internal gazing. I don't have time for internal gazing. Is really to think about things like the music you listen to, or the video games you play, or the movies or TV shows you watch. Yeah. What are they? Are they always serving you as best they could? Knowing my music taste, my sister would probably say they've never served me.
So being aware of what unconsciously is coming up.
Yeah, just to be thinking about, and that's not to say you don't need guilty pleasures of whatever nonsense you'll watch or games you play. But when do they become, they kind of become numbing? It's numbing.
Yeah,
I don't know if did that answer something for you, Corey?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, for sure. I think it's a very common thing that comes up, and it's very, I think, important with a bunch of the work that I do with people when I'm coaching them is to be aware of stuff that happens unconsciously and what it means and what it shows up. Yeah. And I love being able to explain that through talking about archetypes. I know we didn't dive really deep into actual what the archetypes are, but I think this is a good introduction for people if they're like, I'm really intrigued into these archetypes.
You just think of them as patterns. They're just like themes and patterns that appear, and it's independent of gender, age, culture, language groups. They just kind of appear over and over again. And
yeah, because they've shown up through, it's ridiculous because I've done a bunch of research on like Joseph Campbell and a few other people. And it's very interesting understanding the myth and how like the archetypes have been showing up throughout the entire range of history, like forever. And it's like, it's just like this common language that we've had access to, and it's played out through every story, every myth, every religion. And you're like, oh, it's right there and we can apply it to ourselves. How good.
Yes. An archetype, I mean, that's why it's ancient. It comes from the Greek, ancient type, archetypos.
Whoa. I really like that. I didn't know that. Yeah. Ancient type of whoever you are, what's happening internally. It just comes from
the ancient, it's Greek, ancient type, archetypos. Yeah. Apologies to all the Greek people, but I think that's how you pronounce it.
Yeah, I love that. Well, Merle, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on to the
Corey.
Show. If people wanted to research a little bit more into you or the programs or anything that you have to offer, where could they find you or where could they go?
maybe best is LinkedIn is probably a good start. Do you put show notes in?
Yes, you'll be linked in the bottom. So it'll be Merle Singer. You'll be able to find her LinkedIn profile there on that one. And I'll also link in
the
Carol
PMAI. To the PMAI.
To that assessment, because I think I'll probably do that too, and do a video on it and share my results, because I'm excited.
Yeah.
So
okay.
Yeah. So yeah.
I'm interested.
Again, yeah. Thank you so much for coming on the show. If there's anything else that you'd like to share, please do. If not, then yeah.
No, I hope that your listeners found it interesting, or at least thought provoking, and that's great. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I did
a lot.
Me too.
Thanks so much, Corey.
Thank you, Mel. And for everyone listening, we'll see you in the next one, guys.